Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel Learn at Cloud Analytics. As part of the Power BI Zero to Hero series, this is the second module that we are getting started today, which is about data connections in Power BI. So in the first session, we spoke about the introduction about Power BI, and we also went through some basics about the data warehouse concepts. So if you're seeing this video for the first time, I would strongly encourage you to please visit my channel and go through the previous topics, because you would then be able to follow along the topics that we are going to cover going forward. And with that said, this is my GitHub repository, and where I'm trying to curate all the consolidated notes, which would help you to just revise once you finish your the video that I'm posting it, and you can just be prepared and be able to revise as needed. So with that said, let's jump into the topic for today. So today we are going to explore the day 2 topics. So we will see as the time extends, probably if I might need to split this into 2 sessions or 3, we will do that, but for today let's get started. So what are the data connections in Power BI? So here I've tried to create some image just to illustrate the overview about the complete development process. So this is on a very basic level. So as you see here, the first step in creating a report in Power BI is that we need some data. So based on which we are trying to build some reports and analyze the data within that, right? So the first step in the reporting or in this development process is the data discovery phase, which is nothing but identifying where the data is residing in, what type of a data is it, and then how are we going to connect within Power BI. So that's the first step. After we identify the data source where it is residing and we have all the information to connect within Power BI, we establish the connection in Power BI desktop, and once we connect the data, then we will go through the second stage of the development process, which is nothing but the data transformation phase. Because in real time we never get the data in the right format. We always get data in some unstructured data, like unstructured in the sense like probably we might get some nulls being added up, or maybe there are some unwanted rows and columns that we might need to ignore for the reporting purpose, and we might need to do some data cleansing as required, right? And that is where we are going through the second stage, which is quite important, because only after we shape the data into the right format, we are going to be able to build the reports on top of that. And how do we do this particular data transformation? So within Power BI desktop, there is an inbuilt ETL tool called Power Query Editor. So by making use of this Power Query Editor, we would be allowed to make any sort of a data transformations that is needed for our data set. And then comes the third stage of the process, which is the data modeling phase. So in this phase, we are actually trying to connect or establish relationships among multiple tables that is needed for our reporting. We will see. So as this is the very basic session that we are going, like as is the first touch point on going through this entire overview about this journey of developing the report. Just understand these different stages of life cycle in the Power BI development phase, and then as we go into the different sections of these topics, we will deep dive into each one of them respectively. Okay, so every topic that you see here, right, all the stages that we see here on this image are being treated as separate modules and different concepts, so we will have to dig deeper into all of them individually. Alright, now as part of the data modeling, we understood how we've defined the relationships between multiple tables, and we've got the right formatted or right order of how the filtering is enabled on the tables. And with that said, now the fourth stage of the process is that creating some visuals and reports by making use of the inbuilt charts within Power BI desktop, and trying to analyze the data that is needed for the business to draw some key insights out of it. So that is where the fourth stage comes into picture. And then finally we have the final phase, which is nothing but once the reporting is completed, once we develop a report that is needed for the business, then it's the time that we need to share this report to a, into a common place where everyone get access to it and can consume the data within that particular report. And that stage is nothing but publishing the report. So where do we publish this report? So we publish this particular Power BI workbook that is developed within Power BI desktop on our local desktops onto the Power BI service, which is another product from Microsoft Power BI, but it is a cloud-based solution. So that is hosted on the cloud, which is a SaaS product from Microsoft Power BI, and we will publish this report onto Power BI service. So this is the whole journey of a development life cycle within Power BI desktop. And in this session today, we are trying to focus on the first and the second stages of the life cycle. Alright, so I'll go back to my documentation here. So in order to see, so for the first part or the first stage where it says that get data. So in order to connect to the data set, we need to know where our data is residing, right? And through which connector in Power BI desktop can we actually make the connections achieve, right? So let me open Power BI desktop quickly. So this is my Power BI desktop icon that's pinned on my toolbar, and I'll just open this Power BI desktop. While the Power BI desktop interface opens up, I hope every one of you were able to successfully install Power BI desktop on your laptops. But if you have not done that already, I would strongly encourage you to please go ahead and download this Power BI desktop and try to explore and follow along my topic which we are covering today. Alright, so this is the home page that we could see on Power BI desktop. So this is the first preview or the first screen that you would generally see when you open Power BI desktop client on your desktop. And there are multiple options, don't get confused. I would go through in each and every tab and every label that you see here in detail. Alright, so the first section that I would be interested in is the data discovery. Okay, assuming that I know where my data is residing, so I have my data stored in my text file, for example. Now how do I connect to my data which is residing in a text file stored on my laptop, on my desktop itself? Okay, so for that, as you see here right on the top, so this is the home ribbon where you can see different options that are mentioned. We will be looking into each of these options in detail as the topic arrives, but for this concept basis, I'm just focused on this particular section, which is nothing but get data. So on the home ribbon, I'm just selecting this get data icon or this get data option, and here you could already see that it says that these are the commonly used data sources, and all these commonly data sources are something which are widely been used. But in case if your data source is not listed within this section, don't worry, you can always click on this more option, and which would allow you to see all the different types of data source connectors that are provided from Microsoft Power BI. So in case if you are unable to find or if you are unable to scroll through the list of the entire data source connections, you can simply search for that name within the search bar. So for example, if I'm interested to connect to PostgreSQL, so I'll just type in Postgres, and you could see that the respective connections are, or the respective data source connectors have been populated next to me. So in this way, you are able to identify the right connector that is needed for your data source connections and be able to pull the data within Power BI desktop. Alright, now what are the different ways of bringing the data or connecting the data in Power BI desktop? So that becomes my second concern. So I need to understand what are the different ways of making this connections happen. So in Power BI, there are mainly two different types of data connections. The first type is the import connection, and then the second one is the direct query. So these are the two important types of data connections that is available within Power BI desktop. Now we will understand in deep what is import connection and what is direct query connection, and how is it varying from each other, and also we will go with a practical scenario. Alright, so with that said, let me quickly go back to my desktop. Now I will try to connect to let me say, I'll just connect to an Excel workbook and connect to my Superstore dataset. Okay, now if you notice, when I've selected Excel and I've selected my data source as Superstore file Excel workbook from my desktop, Power BI did not ask me which type of a data connection I would like to connect to that particular data source, right? To that particular Excel workbook. It didn't show me any such options to choose between import or a direct mode, right? It just directly extracted the data and it's trying to query within Power BI desktop. So as you could see, within my Superstore Excel workbook, these are the different tables that I have as part of the workbook, and it's allowing me to select the required tables to be loaded within Power BI desktop. Now why is it happening? So by default in Power BI desktop, the default mode of connection for a flat file is an import mode. So in that way, whenever you try to connect to any flat files, so flat files are nothing but your text files, CSV or an Excel. So as such, these are all been termed as a flat file connections. So in general, the default mode of data connection in Power BI is import mode. So when we say an import mode, what happens? Let's see that. Let's say that I would like to extract or I would like to connect to my orders table. So I'll just select the orders table. So this is my navigator window. So within this navigator, I am allowed to see the preview of my data of my respective table that I've selected, and it also shows me the option to either connect or load or transform data. Alright, so this is my load and this is my transform data. So these are the two options that is allowing me to make with respect to this particular orders table. So what is load? Load means if let's say that this particular data set does not need any sort of a data transformation. So I know that this data is perfectly organized and I need not perform any additional data cleansing to my data set. In that case, I need not go to the next step of transformation of this particular data set, but rather I can directly load the data set within Power BI desktop, and that is where this load option comes into play. So when I click load, it will directly import the data set within my PBIX or within my Power BI desktop. But in case if there is a need to perform any data transformations on this particular data set or in this particular table, then I can choose the transform data option directly here, so that it would navigate to my Power Query editor where we can perform the data cleaning and transformations that is needed. Alright, so I will just load this data, or we will go to the transform data so that we also can see how the Power Query editor window would look like, right? So this is my Power Query editor. So this opens up as a separate interface, or within from Power BI desktop itself, it opens up as a separate window, and here we can perform all sorts of data transformations and cleansing as needed for that particular table. Alright, so we've got multiple options here. So we will see in detail about all these options in a bit after we cover the difference between import and direct query. So let me quickly close this and I'll apply this data to my Power BI desktop. So you could see that it's currently loading the data onto my Power BI desktop. Once that process is completed, which means that once the data is loaded, you could see that on the left hand side of this screen there are three icons, right? So there are three different views. One is the report view, which is the default view that you are seeing here. The second one is the table view, and the third one is the model view, right? Now since we've connected in a import mode connection, you can go to the table view and you can actually see the table for that the data of that particular table in that particular table view screen. But if you have connected to a direct mode connection, right, this particular view is not available, so we will see that as well. All right, now let me go back to the report view, and I'll just expand this. So you see all these columns that are coming in from my table orders. Okay, now let's park this topic a little bit and I'll go back to my documentation. Now let's understand what is this import and how is it actually working, right? So in an import mode connection, I think I have taken some screenshots of, yeah. So what happens in an import mode connection is that when you make a connection, right, so the first time when you're trying to connect to that particular data source, so this is my original data source, right? So in that example where I've connected to Superstore data set, Excel workbook, so that's my original data source. So when I try to connect to this particular data set using my Power BI desktop through an import mode connection, what happens is Power BI would try to copy the data that is there in that data set and copy that data set as a local copy in my .pbix file. Okay, and after I get this local copy available within .pbix, for further queries that is needed for my reporting, right? So whenever I try to pull in any sort of a column for my visualization purpose, Power BI would never go back to the original data source to fetch the results, but rather it would go to this local copy in the PBIX file and retrieve the results as needed, which means that the query results are quite faster than compared to going back to the data source, original data source, and bringing it back to Power BI, because this data source might reside in a different place as well, right, where we could have some network latency issues or some performance issues. Because of that, the throughput might be varied, so there are different parameters which might be hit on or toll. So that's why whenever we connect in a import mode connection to the data source, this Power BI desktop will take the copy of that entire data set that is available at that moment and copy that data source, that data set as a .pbix in my local copy, and for further queries that is performed from my Power BI would then be called to this local copy file rather than the original data source. Okay, so in this import mode connection, Power BI is actually making use of its in-memory engine, in-memory data engine, and which is nothing but my Vertipag engine, or it's also called as X velocity. So in import connection, Power BI is making use of its in-memory data engine called Vertipag or X velocity, through which it is able to copy that data that is copied from the original data source in the .pbix file as a local copy. So this local copy that we have within the .pbix file or into the Power BI file is nothing but it is being saved as a compressed columnar format. So let's say that in the original data source, the data size is like maybe 100 MB, for example. Now when it tries to copy it into this local copy, right, in the Power BI file as .pbix, this file size would be reduced by at least 10%. So it will be somewhere around maybe 60 MB or maybe 70 MB. So the size of this file has also been reduced because the data has been stored as a columnar compressed file or the compressed format, which would allow for faster querying and data retrieval. And therefore this particular entire import mode connection gives us very good performance, right? So this is how the import connection works within Power BI. So you might now be able to understand the lines why we are able to see the data within your Power BI file whenever you connect using a import mode connection. So let me recap. Whenever you try to connect to any data source using an import mode connection in Power BI desktop, Power BI would try to take a snapshot of the data that is there in the data source at that moment when you're trying to make the connection. Whatever is there in that data source, it will try to copy the entire data, and it will try to save that copied file onto the local file copy within Power BI as .pbix, and this copy is being saved in a compressed columnar format. And the entire copying file has been done by making use of the VertiPack engine, which is mainly the in-memory engine for Power BI. So in this way, the data is made available to preview within your Power BI desktop, and due to this reason we are able to see the table corresponding data within this data view or this table view. Alright, now let's understand what is the direct query in the other side. So what is exactly happening in the direct query? So when we say a direct query, with the name implies there is a direct connection established between the original data source and so there is a direct connection established. Okay, I will check why this preview is not coming up, but okay. So in the direct query, as you could see, we have the original data source here, and then we have the Power BI desktop here. Now whenever we try to make a connection using a direct query, the Power BI is trying to connect to the original data source in a live mode, which means that whatever changes that is happening at the data source level, at the original data source level, those changes are being reflected within your Power BI desktop instantly. So you do not have any sort of a delay in the updates that might happen at the data source with respect to your Power BI report as well. So all the changes have been reflected directly into your Power BI desktop. So there is always a direct connection, which means that whenever you try to query any data from the data source, every time for every query, Power BI would try to go and talk to the original data source, query the data, and it would try to retrieve the data back to Power BI desktop. So querying is quite expensive, so it will take some time. Sometimes there might be some latency issues as well, and therefore while choosing the data connections in Power BI desktop, it is quite important that we understand and analyze what is the requirement and what is the scope of choosing between import and a direct query. Alright, we will see the scenarios as we work along some further advanced topics as well throughout the project or throughout this entire course of learning this Power BI from end to end. We will be using this import and direct query as needed for building some reports in Power BI desktop. Okay, for now just understand that in direct query connection there is no interface in between, but rather there is a direct query established between the original data source and the Power BI desktop. So whenever you try to drag and drop a column from a table and then you try to create a visual on top of that, every time whenever you're trying to connect to any column or any data within that data source, for every query Power BI has to go and talk to the data source, query the data, fetch the results, and then retrieve it and display it on your report. And that's the difference between import and the direct query mode. Now let's try to do this in a practical mode. we've seen how we are able to establish the connection using an import, right? Now let's see how you can do the same within the direct query as well. So for that, I will try to connect to, I have my Postgres database. So I'll try to connect to a Postgres, and let me say localhost, and which is running on the port 5432. Okay. Let me quickly connect to check what database do I have, so that I can quickly connect to it, and we can then be able to query the data. So as you could see already, right, the moment I'm trying to make a connection to this particular Postgres database, there are two options being provided: import and direct query. So this has been listed within the data connectivity mode. So like I said, the data connectivity mode allows us to uh, tell Power BI how the data connection should be established between the original data source and Power BI desktop, based on which the data refresh that would needs to be happen can be analyzed. So for instance, if you're working on a real-time project, right, where there needs to be some updates happening in real time with respect to your source data, then it's advised that you go with a direct query, or you can also go with an import mode, where if you are able to refresh the data set in some intervals, like maybe every half an hour, if you're allowed to refresh your report and see that data updated after, for every half an hour duration, then you can also go with an import mode based data connections. So it depends on how your project requirements are looking like, and if it allows you to have a data refresh with lesser time, then you can also do that in the same way. Okay, I'm just trying to see. Okay, so I'll try to connect to, okay, so I've tried to connect to the database called Postgres within my PG admin. So you could see that there are two databases. One is Amazon database, the other one is Postgres. So I've tried to connect to this Postgres database, and within my Postgres database, I have one table called customer table. So if I select this customer table, I could also see the preview of my data on my preview panel on the right side. Okay, so this is my navigator window in which I can be able to select the required tables which is supposed to be loaded into Power BI desktop, and I can also see quickly the data preview on my right side pane. Alright, so this is how we can make the import connection and the direct mode connections within Power BI desktop. Now let's say that, okay, let me load this data as well. Okay, so we have this. Okay, so you see this particular difference here. So I went to this table view on my left panel, and I've selected orders table, which is connected in an import mode, and you can also see that on the tooltip which says storage mode is import. Right now, this orders table, since it is an import mode, we are able to preview the data of that particular table. Now the same way, if I select my second table, which is my customer table coming in from my Postgres database but connected in a direct query mode, the data preview is not available. The reason is that, like I said, when we make a connection using a direct query, Power BI does not import the data within Power BI desktop, but rather for every query request, it will have to go and get the data from the original data source and get the results being retrieved within desktop. That's the reason why it's not displaying the preview of my data for my direct query mode connections. Okay, so this is one important comparison or the difference that you might need to be explaining while you are being interviewed on the project. All right. Okay, now let's say that how does this data refresh work within Power BI Desktop. So let's say that I am trying to connect to a text file which I've created in, okay, so I have created one connections file which has this very basic data of product and sales data. Now I'm trying to load this data. Okay, I'll try to show you the way of how you can make this data refresh happen. So let's say that, okay, I'll also open this data so we can see what is happening. So this is my data set that I've created called connections with the columns as product and sales, and product has P1 to P4 products, sales from 100 to 800. Now the same data is being displaying on my Power BI desktop. Now let me try to bring in the product and sales. So I've just selected both product and sales, and I could see the default bar chart has been created for me. Now what I'm interested to look at is, let's say that if there are any data changes at my data source level. So I will add some new product. Okay, so I've added P5 with a sales value as 400. Okay, so this is my new entry in my original data set, and I will save this file. I will come back to Power BI desktop, and you notice that I don't see that P5 product being listed here. Why? The reason is that import mode says that whenever you're trying to connect in an import mode, the Power BI desktop is trying to create a copy of that entire data set at that moment of connection and saves that copy file as a .pbix within Power BI desktop. So every time when you try to query the data, it is simply trying to query the data from your PBIX. So it's just trying to pull the data which is imported or loaded into Power BI desktop, but it is not going back to my original file saved on my desktop called connections. And that is the reason why it's not able to bring in the newly added record into my Power BI desktop view. Now in this situation, how can I be able to update or reflect the current changes noticed on my data set? So for that, on the home ribbon, we have an option called refresh. So we can just simply click on refresh, and that would load the entire data back to my PBIX file with updated records. So what is happening is, whenever you click on refresh, right, Power BI is just trying to create a fresh copy of that entire data set from the original data source into PBIX, and from there it is fetching the results back to the corresponding visual. So in this way we are able to see the updated records onto my bar chart. So now you can see that there is a P5 product with a value of 400 listed. So this is how we are making sure that all the reports that are either connected via an import or a direct query mode, the records or the data is up to date and we are not lagging behind with respect to any data. Alright, so this is all about the different ways of how you can make a data connection in Power BI. So the similar way for even direct connection. So whenever you make any changes in the direct connection, the data is being reflected within the particular within that particular visual. Alright, so now I'll go back to my topic. So I'll just close. Yeah. So now we understood the first stage of connecting to the data. So we've tried to identify where my data source is residing, and I am able to identify the right connector through which we can establish the connection in Power BI Desktop. And we were also able to understand how import and direct query mode connections would happen in Power BI desktop and what are the differences to them. So now that we understood some basics about the data connections, let's understand a little bit about the differences between both the connections. Okay, so I'm just going back. So what would be the differences between both the different types of data connections? The first difference that I can talk about is where is my data being stored when I make a connection using import and the direct query. So when we make a connection in import mode, we already saw that the data is being stored in my Power BI desktop itself. So it is copying the entire data and it is storing it as a local copy file right within my Power BI file. So therefore the storage mode here is that it is being stored in the PBIX file. So .pbix is the extension of your workbook, your Power BI workbook. So we will see that. But then for the direct query mode, the data is not stored anywhere because it is simply trying to establish a direct connection to the respective source and it is querying the results directly from there into your visuals. So it's not storing your data anywhere. So there is no storage for direct query. So that's the first important difference between import and a direct query. Now what are the other differences? So let's say that whenever we have any updates that are happening at the source level, right, how is the data source updating or refreshing the data? So is there any data source dependency? So for import mode, only while performing the refresh we are relying on the data source, right? So only when we need to bring in the updated records into the report, we are using the refresh mechanism on my Power BI desktop. But other than that, for building the reports or querying the data, we don't need to go and connect to my original data source because it already has the copied file locally on my Power BI file. So there is no dependency for an import mode connection, wherein for the direct query, yes, it does strongly rely on the data source because every time whenever we make any new query to create any new visual or a chart, or maybe if you have to create some calculations, there is a dependency to go and communicate or go and fetch the queries from my original data source. So that's the second difference. The third difference that I can speak about is the performance. So in compared to the direct query, the performance is highly or it's seen very good when it is used in a import mode connection because your data is copied within your local PBIX file, and therefore whenever you try to query the data, right, it just fetches the data quite quickly when compared to a direct mode. Because in a direct mode your data source might be residing at a different location where you're residing, so it does deal with a lot of latency issues and network traffic or like the network throughput and all, and that is the reason there could be some performance challenges being noticed, but otherwise import mode gives a very good performance. And then the data transformations. Now, does import and direct queries support all different types of data transformations that we have provided from the tool perspective? So when we use an import mode, it supports all the data transformation features, while in direct query we have some limitations to it. So we will see that uh, when we are going with the data transformations in next few minutes. So this is for my orders table, but when I connect to my customer table, there would be few challenges of or some restricted options not been allowed. So we will see them as well. And then we have the data modeling. So data modeling, it supports all the data modeling activities in the import mode connection, while in direct query it wouldn't support all the features. So there are some restrictions again. So if I go back to my direct model view, right, so there are few things where we would need to consider. So this is in my direct connection and these two are in my import mode connection. So you could always see that whenever you hover your cursor on this particular table, right, the storage mode is being displayed as direct query. And if you observe, there is a small difference to the icon representation of these two tables. See, orders and connections tables have a cylinder icon. There is a small icon on the left top corner, right? That indicates that these two tables have been connected via an import mode, and the data is residing locally within the particular workbook file. Whereas the customer table on the other side, you see there is an up arrow and a down arrow that indicates that it has a direct query connection established to the original data source. And whenever we try to uh, query any data using this particular table, it would have to go and fetch the results from that particular data source. So that's the indication of the direct query and the import mode connections. There are few fallbacks as well with respect to data analysis. So not all DAX expressions are allowed within direct mode connections, whereas in an import mode you get to use all the DAX functions that are available from the product side. So you get that leverage of using all the DAX functions that are available, but in a direct mode there are few limitations in using few functions, and you're not allowed to use every function that is provided. So these are the important differences between the direct and an import mode connections in Power BI desktop. So I hope these differences and this particular concept is understood to most of you. If you are liking this concept and if you are understood, please do leave a comment on my comment box, and please share your thoughts about how you are establishing data connections in your project, and how do you see this differences being noticed as well. So until now, we've been able to cover the basic transformations and what are the different types of data connections in Power BI. So we went through the introduction to the data connections that are available in Power BI, and we've understood the key differences in using both of them as well, right? So I hope you understood this topic together, and that's it for today. So we will be talking about the continuation of this topic in the next session. So until then, have a nice day, and I hope you all are motivated to keep continuing this learning journey together, because we wanted to excel in getting the job and also be able to sustain in um, doing the real-time project when hired. So if you're watching this video for the first time, please do share your comment, and also please do subscribe to my channel and support me, so that it would help me to reach to a wider audience and also help other users who are able to make their journey into Power BI. So with that said, thank you all, and we will talk again in the next session.